Na crescente pressão planetária que a crise climática impõe nas existências humana e não humana, a extração de lítio é tida como imperativa para uma transição energética consequente. Mas se por um lado a descarbonização parece fundamental, por outro é urgente acompanhar estas mudanças por um praticar de justiças ambiental e social. No contexto da primeira edição do Índex da Arte e Tecnologia, olhamos para as paisagens socioambientais implicadas na promessa da transição energética. Algumas delas estão a escassos quilómetros do local desta bienal, outras a milhares de quilómetros. Quisemos pô-las em diálogo para perceber que modalidades definem o extrativismo atual e que disputas, alianças e resistências têm sido desenvolvidas nestes pontos nevrálgicos da rede global de extração, distribuição e utilização de lítio. Eu sou o Tiago Patatas e com a Liliana Coutinho e a Raquel Pais reunimos ideias e práticas de pensadores, ativistas, movimentos sociais e redes transcontinentais nos campos da ciência política, práticas espaciais, agroecologia, ideologia, entre outras, para um entendimento plural das práticas extrativas dedicadas à chamada transição verde. Este é o primeiro de 2 episódios e começamos pela relevância do mineral lítio, como nos explica Thea Riofrancos, cientista política e professora no Providence College.
So lithium is considered a, quote, critical mineral. I like to put that phrase in quotes because to question a bit, what is considered critical, what isn't. I won't go there, but I'm just kind of flagging it. But it's considered a, quote, critical mineral for the energy transition because it plays so far a non-substitutable role in lithium-ion batteries. Lithium is just an essential ingredient to make those batteries. Those batteries are in turn the predominant modality for electrifying transportation. Just to put that into context, in the United States, which is where I'm speaking from, transportation is the number one source of emissions, right? So if we want rapid and just climate action, we need to get the emissions out of transportation. Lithium also has a secondary but also important role in that larger batteries, larger than you might find in a car, are important to stabilize renewable energy grids that are intermittent, right? So sun and wind are not always shining and blowing, so you need a place to store the energy. Lithium batteries are one of a few technologies that can serve that purpose on energy grids.
Dada a preponderância atual do lítio, interessa perceber onde e como este mineral tem vindo a ser extraído. Por essa razão, começamos por nos debruçar sobre o Chile.
Chile is the number 2 producer of lithium in the world after Australia. The other important producers, for what it's worth, are Argentina and China. I'll note later that that list will expand and change in the coming years. But for now, those are the top producers. So Chile is number 2. Chile also, for what it's worth, is the number 1 producer of copper, which is another metal that's very important in the energy transition. So there's a lot of extractivism in Chile related to the energy transition, and it occurs in similar territories. I think that's important to note.
Para além do ímpeto extrativista imposto pela transição energética nesta região, o Chile tem já uma longa história de extração, como nos conta Ramón Balcázar, investigador, ativista e coordenador do Observatório Plurinacional de Salares Andinos.
In Chile, we always say that Calama or the copper mines are the salary of Chile. I heard that since I was a child. The north of Chile actually was a whole territory of extraction. But at that time, I didn't realize that also the agribusiness was another way of extractivism. Today, those territories are also dry and people are fighting for water also there. It's a problem. It's a big problem everywhere in Chile, not only in the desert. Lithium mining is actually something that we need to understand also in a more kind of complex context. It's not as if lithium mining arrived to a place that has never been exploited, for example, or a place that is not suffering the impacts of climate change itself. So lithium mining is expanding in very already degraded environments.
Interessa, pois, entender o que define o extrativismo, como nos explica Godofredo Pereira, professor no Royal College of Art, que liderou recentemente o projeto Lithium Triangle.
Uma coisa é a extração, quer dizer, extração no sentido da mineração, no sentido de relações simbióticas com a Terra sempre existiram, quer dizer, define muitas coisas. Há um termo que me é mais útil, que é o extrativismo, que é um termo que originalmente vem do Eduardo Godinas, para falar um certo tipo de extração que é completamente fora de escala. E o Godinas fala de extrativismo no sentido de uma quantidades gigantescas de extração de material natural. Por um lado, há duas coisas que eu faço me deu jeito de fazer esse termo, que é muito útil para pensar as questões não só das relações de desenvolvimento, mas a história do capitalismo e a história do colonialismo, que são tanto o capitalismo e o colonialismo, que fazem parte do mesmo processo, são extrativistas desde o início. O colonialismo é uma aventura extrativista. E é extrativista na medida em que não tem nenhum parâmetro de quantificação de um limite. Não há limite para o extrativismo. O extrativismo podemos defini-lo como um vetor imparável. Uma certa forma de delírio.
Lithium specifically is currently extracted from the Salar de Atacama, which is the Atacama salt flat, which is an enormous expanse of salted crust in a closed basin in the driest desert on Earth, and actually the second driest place on Earth, the Atacama Desert. So it's a very dry environment. It's a very high solar radiation environment. It's a high altitude environment. It's a mountainous and beautiful environment. And the lithium specifically is submerged underground in brine deposits, so in deposits of salt water that naturally occur underneath the salt crust. And so you can think of the process of extraction, because it is a bit unusual. It's not like your typical maybe image of mining. What it is basically is the brine, which contains lithium as well as some other valuable minerals, is sucked out from where it is underneath the salt crust, and then it is arrayed on these enormous evaporation ponds. All of this occurs on this huge salt flat surrounded by Andean mountains. The sun that I mentioned earlier, that it's very sunny, does a lot of the work of concentration. So it's actually, in many ways, the quote, gifts of nature, both the lithium, but also the role of the sun and the high altitude are being used in the extraction process. So when the lithium is in these enormous pools, little by little, the liquid evaporates, and the lithium then is moved. The resulting liquid is moved from pool to pool as the concentration increases. At the end, you have a lithium-dense liquid that is then transported elsewhere in Chile to be further processed, and then it goes, elsewhere in the world to enter into battery cells, and then eventually electric vehicles. So that's a bit of the supply chain.
Esta é uma das várias iterações na corrida extrativista ao lítio. Seguimos a nossa análise para entender que mudanças geopolíticas têm ocorrido à escala planetária.
Why is lithium expanding everywhere? Why not just stay with the four main producers and import, everywhere else? And that, I think, speaks to the heightening and escalating geopolitics of lithium, where countries, or governments, I should say, and corporations in the global north, in the affluent countries of the world, are very interested in onshoring is the sort of technical term, but in bringing lithium extraction and other critical minerals within their borders in order to, quote, dominate these supply chains and have control over different aspects of the supply chain. So that's one key reason that lithium extraction is spreading to new territories. And also we have the enormous and growing and sort of exponential demand for lithium, which means that there can be growing projects and there is enough demand, let's say, to buy all of that lithium for the coming, decade or two of the energy transition.
Vale a pena fazer breve desvio para questionar o que se entende por estes limites entre o norte e sul globais, no contexto do extrativismo.
These categories they originate from the violence of colonialism and the extraction that was part and parcel of colonial relations, and also what we might call neo-colonial relations. So maybe, countries are all formally independent, they have political sovereignty, but they remain trapped in a very similar global hierarchy that dictates where resources flow, where labor flows, where materials, where, who appropriates land, but also, on the flip side, who gets the monetary surplus and profit of those flows, right? This is called, what I just described by scholars, unequal economic exchange and unequal ecological exchange. And those are basically two sides of the same coin. But the idea is that there's a net appropriation of natural resources, land, labor, et cetera, from the global south into the circuits of production and exchange that are dominated by countries in the global north. Likewise, the global north countries see a net monetary surplus from that trade, right, and from those flows. And so that's the kind of ecological economic relationships that structure the world.
Several projects, decades of exploitation, and climate change, and then the expansion of lithium mining, So it's quite serious, and unfortunately, it's very hard to do something about it because actually the licenses, the contracts are already there, and actually we see how there's a lot of impunity, especially in the case of SQM, because of the connections with the politics. These mines or these companies actually also their networks are very strong, and the Chilean law allows that. But maybe it's going to change with the new constitution. Maybe it can change, but I'd say that the corporate capture of the state and the institutions and social actors in Chile, it's one of the main problems, actually. Maybe it's even more serious than the extraction itself.
Governments in the global north have said our like geopolitical stature, our position in the world is not just about how much resources and money and profit we can command through the sort of global trade system, but also about actually having immediate territorial control over the supply chain. Global North leaders say, we want to make the batteries at home, we want to make the electric vehicles at home, but we also, given the global insecurity and volatility and risk, we also want the raw materials, right? Because there's not geological shortages, it's not geologically scarce, but there are market shortages of lithium, meaning it's in short supply if you want to buy it. It's therefore very expensive. And so there are various concerns that go into this. But in the EU and the US, almost in tandem, like in parallel, there have been policy measures, incentives specifically, we could say giveaways or help to subsidies to corporations, mining corporations, battery, electric vehicle, down the whole supply chain, to set up their shops, to set up their economic activities, their mines, their factories, et cetera, within the borders of global north countries. When we look, for the most part, at which landscapes or communities are being targeted, we might say, for extraction in the global north of lithium and other critical minerals, it tends to be communities that are already marginalized, that did not really benefit in the same way from these neocolonial economic relations. So I'm talking about indigenous communities, for example, in the US, or in Europe, I'm talking about, when we look at Spain and Portugal, agro-pastoral communities, where we've also seen a lot of economic hardship in rural areas, right? And so oftentimes these extraction projects are presented as like some great economic benefit. But, we have to look more closely and say, there's a lot of social and environmental harm and dislocation. Those communities are already less powerful in a political sense to ensure that, the regulations and all of the best practices are applied. And also, sometimes those elites of those societies consider those communities and landscapes disposable and sacrificable in a similar way to the kind of neo-colonial gaze on the global south, right? And so we start to see these almost lateral or horizontal connections between communities north and south that are being affected by this onslaught of mining.
I wouldn't say that that we can really compare one case to another necessarily. But what we always see, or what's I think that the common element, it's this: you need to you put the interest or the national interest over over life in rural territories. So it's always territories that you can sacrifice anyways, because they are not important for the economy. And there is always this idea of like, which is very dangerous. I think that it's the priority or the urgency of lithium extraction. It's something that we need, something that you cannot question. So you cannot question lithium mining in Chile or in Portugal or in Serbia or in Spain, because it's for the good of everyone,
Neste imperativo da extração de lítio, um argumento comum é o de que esta mudança da localização da extração para, por exemplo, os continentes europeu ou norte-americano, fará com que as condições laborais e ambientais das práticas extrativas sejam consideravelmente melhoradas. Esta promessa de um futuro verde e sustentável é questionável, como a Thea Riofrancos nos descreve.
Environmentally, and especially when we look at extraction, there's a lot of regulatory loopholes, we might say. There's a lot of regulatory deficiencies. I'll name two examples, and I think it'll be very clear. In the United States, the law, the main piece of law that regulates hard rock mining and actually it includes like brine and the kind of mining of water that we talked about earlier, because there are brine and lithium deposits in the US. But anyway, that regulates mining, not oil and gas, but mining for metals in the US is from 1872. That year may not mean anything to your listeners, but I want to explain why that's important. Two things. One is it's very old. It's a law from the late 19th century. We're in the 21st century right now. In the interim, the mining industry is totally transformed. It's much bigger. It's more capital intensive. It's more invasive. It creates many more ecological impacts because of its sheer scale. Another thing that's important that might be less known to listeners is, in the 1870s, we are talking about the height of violent genocide and settler colonialism against indigenous peoples. And in fact, this mining law from 1872 was designed to encourage, quote, westward expansion, i.e. the displacement and dispossession of indigenous people and the taking of their land, especially land with valuable resources like minerals. Let me go to the other side of the Atlantic briefly. Spain and Portugal have 0 to weak legislation around tailings basins. And so that just gives you an example that we should not always assume that in the global north that standards are so much higher. And we always have to remember that there's inequalities within the global north. Two ways, at least, to address the harms of mining and reduce the harms of mining. And I want to be clear that the only way in absolute terms to reduce the harms of mining is to have less mining. I don't want to be misleading. There is some mining required for the energy transition. We do need to manufacture additional solar panels and wind turbines and electric vehicles compared to the quantity that we currently have. There's no way to transition to renewable energy without those technologies and infrastructures. However, that is kind of, a basic fact. The rest is an open question. How much do we need to produce? Who is going to benefit from it? Under what conditions is it produced? Where are the minerals extracted from? How much is extracted? All of that are political questions, right? And I mean political in two senses. One has to do with the policy and investment decisions made way downstream, way on the other side of the supply chain. When we're talking about the end use of these technologies in our cities and states within the global north, let's say, because we're talking from the global north right now, both of us, right? So in the US, what kind of transportation system are we building? What kind of energy grid are we constructing? What kind of green housing are we constructing? All of those has a lot of implications for how much lithium or copper or nickel or cobalt or whatever is demanded and required and then flowing across the global market, right?
Dos pequenos componentes da justiça climática tem a ver com a transição energética. Né? Dos componentes da transição energética tem a ver com a eletromobilidade. E dos componentes da eletromobilidade é o carro individual. Só que agora viramos esta pirâmide em que o carro individual é um detalhe e se virares isto na tua cabeça de pernas para o ar, o que temos a liderar este processo inteiro globalmente é o carro individual, porque é o que dá dinheiro. Carro individual, em vez de eletromobilidade, que tem a ver com, podia ter a ver exclusivamente com eletrificar transportes públicos e criar muito mais barato e eficiente, uma rede muito mais barata e eficiente de transportes coletivos. E, portanto, convém ter um bocadinho de cuidado, e essas escalas são muito importantes. Porquê? Porque se vamos assumir que não é nem sim nem não, que é preciso, nós vivemos numa relação simbiótica com o mundo, é preciso ter qualquer coisa para fazer qualquer coisa, quer dizer, obviamente que se tu vais ser afetado pela extração, queres ter alguém, um mecanismo correto que te diga de que maneira é que podes contestar, de que maneira é que podes comentar, de que maneira é que podes ajustar e de que maneira é que este impacto negativo vai dar a uma série de impactos positivos e como é que medimos um em relação ao outro.
Relatedly, however, and I do want to think of these as related, we have, of course, also the immediate power and political relations of extractive landscapes. So how empowered are communities to resist and critique practices that are harming them and their landscapes and livelihoods? How empowered is the regulatory arm of the state to actually constrain capital? The more empowered communities are, the more organized, the more aware of their rights, the more there are rights, right? The more those communities have also prior experience in being part of social movements and in defending their territory and in defending their livelihoods, etc., the more they can actually constrain what extractive capital does.
Interessa, pois, perguntar que alianças podem ser formadas para uma reflexão e reação consequentes à máquina extrativa.
Estabelecer e apoiar ligações entre comunidades é muito importante. Há as ligações entre comunidades entre elas, há as ligações entre comunidades e advogados, há ligações entre comunidades e peritos da investigação. Por exemplo, há todo um campo de ativismo muito committed ao nível académico, ao nível de investigação, ao nível da advocacia, ao nível da justiça climática, há múltiplas escalas também. Portanto, é preciso uma certa prática, uma certa nuance, que não há fórmulas para explicar como fazer isto bem, que não seja militância. Estar lá presente, constante, a lidar com as dificuldades.
And we see many examples in the world, and it's surprising given how unequal, the relationships are between a multinational mining company and like a small rural community, let's say. Many examples in the world of communities stalling, stopping, forcing the cancellation of mining projects. Recently, with the cancellation of the contract of Rio Tinto in Serbia. We also have many examples of communities demanding better regulation from their governments, right? And of that happening. I'm not saying in the majority of cases this happens. In the majority of cases, we have harm basically, but we have many examples of communities winning something, whether it's the end of the project or better terms, right? And so that's very important.
Do acumular de paisagens extrativas e seus termos de operação à militância em pontos nevrálgicos da rede logística que conduz a distribuição do lítio pelo mundo, parece imperioso clarificar que transição energética é possível.
I think that, we have two choices with the energy transition. I'm going to radically simplify it, but just for a rhetorical effect, I think we have two choices. One is we keep as much the same as possible and we switch oil, gas, and coal for sun, wind, and geothermal. But everything else stays the same. The car dependency, the consumption levels, the fast fashion, the rate of energy consumption, the energy inefficiencies, the vast inequality, the unequal consumption of the 1%. I mean, everything about our unequal, rapacious, harmful, extractivist society stays in place, except we have a different energy source. That's one version, and that's the hegemonic version, and that's the version we're often sold by politicians, sometimes by more mainstream climate, organizations as well, et cetera. Another version is to say, there are root causes of the climate crisis. Those root causes are the same as the causes of extractivism. They're the same as the causes of global inequality. They're the same of the causes of many forms of social and environmental harm and inequality around the world. And so this is an opportunity, the energy transition, to not just change a fuel source or a power source, but to actually change something more fundamental about the way that we live, the patterns of production and consumption that really are what our everyday lives and political economies are made of. And so I think that, with lithium in particular, one way that I think is vital to reduce how much lithium mining is needed in the first place, in addition to, of course, we should recycle as much as possible, we should use it as efficiently as possible, but let's also talk about reducing the amount of mining, is to say that we need to encourage a shift away from individual passenger vehicles. In Europe, this shift has actually further along. There are cities that have declared themselves car-free. There's much better mass transit in Europe. Europe's a place where this is actually a very viable idea. There's more density, et cetera. In the US, it's a bigger lift, but there are many metropolitan regions that some of which have mass transit systems, but they're not very well funded. And even we could think about what would it look like to bring mass transit more into the suburbs and into more spatially dispersed areas, even outside of cities. But the point is that the more that we can use the same transportation system, right, the same vehicles, the same buses, the more that buses can carry more people, right, as opposed to all of us in our individual cars and then locked in a garage all day, the more efficiently we use the resources we extract and the fewer overall resource levels we will need. And that's just one example. We could go to the energy system, to the housing and construction sectors, and talk about what would reduce the resource intensity, how much energy they use and how much raw materials they use. And there's always solutions. The question is, how do we politically articulate those? How do we fight for those and demand those? And how do we do it in a way that is actually with the whole supply chain in view so that we're in solidarity with communities that are affected by mining?
Na procura de uma transição energética que é também justa, o segundo episódio desta série irá debruçar-se sobre que estratégias têm sido aplicadas no contexto português para conservar territórios e modos de coexistência. E irá explorar de que formas redes de solidariedade nacionais e transnacionais, assim como novas modalidades de internacionalismo, têm respondido aos avanços da máquina extrativa. A música neste episódio é de Luís Fernandes.